This is probably a poor question to ask of a non-professional historian, but you're the one who collected the collection and did the research. So, from a professional historian's point of view, may even strike you as a tangent, and it's not meant to be. If I wanted to do a biography, if I were doing a doctoral dissertation or a book on, say, for example, Bob Haldeman, and there's reason to assume that that might happen somewhere down the road, well past this.
Actually, there is one in the works on John Mitchell.
Well,
so
okay. Is the collection useful from a biographical point of view in terms of the characters themselves, the personalities? One of the things that I'm trying to do here is to separate between the events and the facts and your interpretations and conclusions and the personalities that this collection contains, because we both know, and our viewers should realize, that this is a collection involving listening and original conversations with all of the major players of the Nixon presidency.
With the exception of Nixon and Kissinger.
With the exception of Nixon and Kissinger. So the question is, if I did not want to research Watergate, but if I wanted to do a biography of Bob Haldeman, is the collection valuable to me?
Yes. And Bob Haldeman is an interesting character because you think of this crew-cut Germanic individual.
Sure.
The Bob Haldeman on those tapes is not that. And Bob, you can hear Bob Haldeman struggling to figure Watergate out. It's clear to me he really doesn't understand it. When you read his book, you also understand he has a piece of it here, but he never is able to put the pieces together. I've talked to his wife and interviewed her, and she said that he changed as Silent Coup.
Sure.
And where he had put Watergate behind him and he wasn't going to look at it anymore, he became intrigued again because the pieces started to make sense. That piece that he knew with pieces that he didn't know. And ironically, she told me, he decided as a result of Silent Coup to release his diaries. So we now have his diaries as a byproduct of Silent Coup. So you're going to hear, for that period in his life and how he puts things together and what he's thinking while he's out of office, understanding that you're not dealing, because you got to, when you do a biography, you go all the way back.
Right.
It's a retrospective part of the biography. It's Haldeman trying to come to grips with what he went to prison for, right, and why he went and what really happened.
Okay, let's start shifting the gear at least and take on the controversial issue of John Dean and Len Colodny and a lawsuit that has been in existence for 8 years in Hillsborough County. First,
in D.C.
In D.C., excuse me. I said in Hillsborough County. The collection contains a good bit of that record that has been a part of the lawsuit. Can you describe that part of the collection for us?
Well, it is a very important document. Benton Becker, who is my attorney and was President Ford's counsel, and who negotiated the pardon for Richard Nixon, and the tape transfer and so on and so forth. When we prepared, and I guess this will be helpful to those who don't know, in our country, in order to get rid of public figure lawsuits, you don't even have to be right about what you wrote. You just have to show that there was no malice and that you, in fact, had a basis for what you were saying. And we decided, once Dean sued on 97 whatever counts, we would take all that research material and put it in one place, because here it was sort of spread out. In Silent Coup, it's condensed and you don't know what. And we created a 5,000-page document, 500 pages of declaration and 3,500 pages plus of exhibits. And that is to back up everything we said. Even if we were wrong about Dean, it would have passed the New York Times versus Sullivan test. That's why we've not had a ruling. The establishment, who doesn't like Silent Coup because it busts the myth, they don't want a ruling against me because that hurts them. It's a First Amendment case, and hey, Colodny's got all this stuff. If he can't pass it, then we're going to lose down the line.
Right.
The other thing is we don't want the judge ratifying what Colodny has done. So we've now lost a judge 7.5 years into the case. A judge, Harold Green, who broke up AT&T, didn't want to deal with Watergate. So all that material is there to back up every word we wrote about John Dean. And we still stick by what we wrote. To this day, John Dean has called it names, but he hasn't produced the factual basis. But in the collection, we didn't think it was fair to just have Len Colodny's response to John Dean. We have 4,000 pages of John Dean responding to Colodny, and you will be able to judge for yourself. That's what this collection is about. That's why it's at USF. It's everything. It's all the raw stuff, not because of John Dean and not because it's controversial, but this is the way research should be done. So we're going to make available on the internet not just the Colodny version, but the John Dean rebuttal. And someone can, a researcher, student, whatever, can make his judgment based on that. When Benton Becker decided to do a 5,000 page instead of a 500 page, he was writing for history. We forced John Dean to write for history too by feeling, well, gee, if we wrote 5,000, he better write at least 4,000. We think his depositions are significant. We think when he gives up his book, he's giving up something very important. And why would you do that? So there's a lot of questions out there. I have my answers, but now we want the answers of this generation and the next generation, and that's the beauty of this collection. It really is there. All its warts, all its problems, my mistakes, it's all there. And it's rare that a journalist would do this. It is very rare that I don't know of a journalist that's ever said, here's everything I've got, go to it. But I'm also confident that when the day is done, Silent Coup will be not controversial, but accepted. We will know more about Watergate rather than less, sooner rather than later, as a result of the people who will come to either the website or physically come to the library. And we're going to do things to promote the collection and promote further research. Silent Coup is not the answer. It points us in the right direction, but it's not the answer. There's a lot more we don't know, and that's what this is all about. So it's worth giving up the raw data in order to open that window. There are things on those tapes that I don't have any idea what they mean, but they may mean something to some researcher 30 years from now who comes to USF and the latest Nixon tapes have been released. Because the Nixon presidency is going to go on forever. Unlike other presidents who go into their library, we've got 3,700 hours of Nixon tapes floating around. We have people playing with those tapes and editing those tapes to suit their version of history. Unlike them, I said, here, come get it. I'm confident in where Silent Coup takes us. I'm confident that what you get on all sides is going to be the real deal. And I'm also confident that each of you will use your individual judgments and opinions and conclusions. And they may differ from mine, and that's fine. That's what this is about. That's what the First Amendment's about. That's what good journalists should be doing. Roger Morris, who wrote the foreword to Silent Coup, said, look, the newspaper story was but the first draft of history. If I wrote a book and I said that my source was in a garage, that he drinks, that he smokes, that the way we signaled each other was with a flower pot, that the way we signaled each other was with a flower pot, that can't be seen from the street, that there's 20 New York Timeses downstairs, I know which New York Times he circled, I'd be laughed out of town. But that's the accepted version today. But Woodward has come a long way, and we're going to have a lot of new Woodward stuff. Woodward and Bill Casey. Mrs. Casey wrote me a note. That book will be in the collection. Woodward interviewed a brain-dead man and managed to get a story. I don't know. I haven't been that lucky. But Woodward is still controversial today, and it's on the source issue. It's on the source issue. And so when we talk about the tapes and why I tape, where are Woodward's tapes? He'd have been smarter to do it that way. Interesting
you raise that. So let's talk about it a quick second, from an historian's point of view versus a journalist's point of view. Is Silent Coup good journalism, or is it good history, or what?
It's good investigative reporting from which historians, drawing from it and other valuable source information, will be able to get a better fix on what happened. Watergate is not the Kennedy assassination. It's not about puffs of smoke. It's not about triangulation. It's not about any of that. There's good, solid, hard evidence about Watergate, what it was all about, what happened, what the break-in was all about. More importantly, it deals with the secret government that Richard Nixon was running. That's the more serious crime, not the break-in at the Watergate. And that's where we want people to focus. Get away from John Dean. Get away from that break-in, because something would... You know, you have to go back to the 60s and 70s. J. Edgar Hoover and breaking into places was commonplace. Putting a tape recorder under Martin Luther King's bed was his idea of investigating in those days. You have to remember, it's a different day today. And when you go back to that time, a lot of things were done that were wrong.
Well, you know, we're there. Your comment a couple of minutes ago was let's go where the book takes us. So let's start, because where the book starts is exactly what you have brought up, and I think it's fair to our viewers who have not read Silent Coup, despite it having been on the best-selling list, to know that when I first read it, my reaction may be a very typical one. Why on earth, on a book that I know is about Watergate, are we beginning to talk about a spy ring happening inside the military structure of government, and that spy ring spying on the President of the United States and his chief foreign policy advisor? How did you find that as the beginning point? I guess is the first question, Len. Before you describe what it is, it probably would be nice to know you're plugging down pieces of research, you're going along in a process, you're making phone calls, and then all of a sudden, somewheres in this process, somehow this pops out.
Well, it pops out in the way we want other things to pop out. Seymour Hersh wrote a wonderful book on Kissinger called The Price of Power. And he goes into this spy ring story in great detail. But he doesn't have the final nail. It's clear it happened to me. And it began to crystallize in my mind as I read Cy's book, which is an excellent book. Anybody that really wants a feel for good journalism. And that's the difference between journalism and historian. Cy was out digging and, so forth. And we looked at that. And it became very clear that the worst part of the Nixon presidency was why the spy ring happened. Here was a man who trusted nobody. He had a very tight-knit group: Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell. Kissinger was sort of let in, but it may have been 5, 6 people, tops. And he had discovered from his days as Eisenhower's vice president, where this National Security Advisor's Office was sort of the centerpiece for all information. The CIA sent all its information there. The State Department, all the IAs, the Defense Department, everything went through this little office in the bottom. And he realized that he could actually run the government from that little office without anyone knowing what he was doing.
Do you have any... 2 questions. Do you have any sense of why he was alone in discovering that?
Well, first you have to understand Richard Nixon, the way he thought. He didn't trust anybody. The government was full of a bunch of liberal democratic Jews or whatever he thought was there. They were going to thwart him. The Democrats controlled the Congress. They were going to thwart him. He didn't trust his cabinet. They were going to just go out there and grandstand, he thought. I'm the president. I'm going to run the government, and I'm going to get what I want done. And he knew what he wanted done. He knew he wanted to go to China. He knew that when he was at his law firm in 64 and 65 and 66. And he knew to do these kinds of things, he couldn't let the Congress know. He couldn't let his cabinet know. His secret bombing of Cambodia was done around the Secretary of Defense. I mean, the chain was broken. He found, boy, you can get a lot done if you don't have a democracy. So this country was coming very close to a dictatorship in the way he was operating. We have a check and balance system, which I feel pretty passionate about. I think it's a good thing, whether it's a Republican Congress or a Democratic Congress or whoever is it. Hey, go fight, folks. Keep an eye on each other because you can't trust them. I was virulently anti-Vietnam. I was involved in Vietnam teach-ins in 65 and 66. I knew what was going on. I knew why I opposed it. My father kept saying, well, Johnson knows something you don't know. Well, now it turns out I've heard the Johnson tapes, and I knew a lot more than Johnson did.
But let's go back to Nixon in his office.
But he realized its potential in the Eisenhower years for what he wanted to do.
How do you know that?
Because the people that have written about it and have written about Nixon and are talking to people like Roger Morris, that's how it all worked. And so he really formed a secret government. 5 people knew he was going to China. One day you wake up and Henry Kissinger had a cold in Pakistan, and the next thing you know, and think about this, the military is watching him withdraw troops at the same time they're requesting more troops. And what the military is thinking is, you know what, the CIA has Nixon's ear. Or somebody else has. The truth was nobody had Nixon's ear. Nixon's so-called secret plan, which he talked about in the '68 campaign, and which I talked about with John Mitchell on these tapes, was to bleed us out of Vietnam. That was the secret plan. We were going to take the ARVN, who was the South Vietnamese army, and replace our guys. Our guys wanted to win. So they said, wait a minute, something's going wrong. This is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And so they start to set up a spy ring. And they start stealing in order to try and find out what's happening inside the secret government.
In your book, let's not, and I assume that everything I'm asking or what's in the book is somewhere and somehow documented in the collection.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's track from the book, from what I know, and not from the collection for the moment, on the subject of this spy ring. If then the obvious conclusion to draw is that the Joint Chiefs decide to spy on the president because he's not giving or forthcoming with what his plans and policies are, as you point out, a secret government, how did you find that? My assumption is that whatever memos may have passed would have been under the highest of security clearances, and certainly Len Colodny would not have had clearance to see that stuff even in the after effects of the 1980s. If my memory serves me right, you still would not have been able to just breeze in to get that material that would document the very thesis you're working with, that because Mr. Nixon was so secret, the Joint Chiefs felt that they needed to have a spy ring spying on the President of the United States. And to make no bones about it, is that a fair statement, the way I've just said it, that the highest military structure in the government of the United States determined that they didn't trust the President of the United States, so they established an independent spy ring?
Well, you know, they weren't stupid when they were cutting out the Secretary of Defense. When Moore and those guys knew, hey, wait a minute, he isn't even telling the Secretary of Defense what we're doing. It almost all came crashing down in a Pulitzer Prize-winning piece by Jack Anderson called "The Tilt to Pakistan." Joint Chiefs wake up one day and they find that we're moving ships out of Vietnam toward the Indian Ocean. The Soviets are sending their ships toward our ships. They're backing India. We're backing Pakistan. The reason we're backing Pakistan is we are secretly dealing with the Pakistanis to get to China. Right. They go nuts. That's why they leaked what they leaked. That's how the spy ring accidentally was discovered, through that leak. But the fact of the matter is, they wake up and, wait, who's giving the orders? You know, the commander-in-chief is. He just isn't telling the admirals what he's doing. And so the way they wanted to stop the ships, and the way they did it was to leak. But the point I'm making is that this is pervasive in the Nixon methodology. The end justifies the means. When he learns there's a spy ring, when it's conclusive, there's a tape recording of Admiral Wellender, who was the man in the White House who was directing this yeoman in the stealing operation.
Mr. Radford.
Mr. Yeoman Radford. And he takes all this information and he goes in John Ehrlichman's office, right above the Oval Office, and speaks into a tape recorder and admits to everything, and implicates Alexander Haig, by the way. They're all in this thing. And this tape is now the hard evidence that Nixon would need to get rid of them in December of 1971. Nixon's reaction is cover it up. He says to Mitchell, you talk to Moore and see what he has to tell you. And of course Moore comes out and says, we didn't do anything. In those tapes, when I interview Moore, he's denying it still, until I start reading from the secret tape recording, which he thinks is still locked up in the archives. John Ehrlichman went in, since he did the tape, interview and got me the actual tape recording. And you'll have it with the handwriting on it and everything, as it was done by David Young that day in that office.
So if somebody wants to document what they read in your book, or they want to explore it through the collection process at USF, they're going to find at some points hard evidence that Admiral Moore did in fact confess to somebody in his own words that there was in fact a spy ring.
First it will be Admiral Wellender who will do it. The cover-up's even more funny because
Before we get to that part, though, Len, seriously, is the documentation there on the part of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Well, he would argue in my interview, oh, I knew all that stuff. But then he'd also admit he got that stuff. So but Admiral Wellender is the most credible source for this because he was directing it, and he admits to everything. What's interesting is there's a second interview conducted by Fred Buzzhart, the counsel over at the Defense Department. They re-interview Wellender over there, and they strike Al Haig's name from it. So Haig gets washed out in the revised version. We got both versions. W. Donald Stewart, who's on our advisory committee, he uncovered this thing. And he can explain it better than anyone else what this was all about. And he was very helpful. But he was amazed that I had the first interview. He didn't know that there was a taped White House interview. He had been there for the phony one, which erased Al Haig out of the picture. So when you look at these, when you see these things are brought to the president's attention, and the president says, and it's really interesting because that spring he could have fired Moore and no one would have known it. He was up for reappointment. All you have to do is bring the bands out, give him another medal and say, see ya. Nope, that's not what Nixon thought he'd do. Cover it up, that's his knee-jerk reaction. Cover it up. Same as he would do 6 months later with Watergate. This is vintage Nixon. He doesn't even want to see the tape. He doesn't want to see the transcript. He doesn't want to know.
Lots of people have said of Richard Nixon, or would agree with your statement you made some bit ago when we were talking earlier about him and about his desire to avoid controversy, as well as the distrust issues. Are they both connected here? Is this a guy who just simply wants, as a knee-jerk reaction is your word, that all of this generally phrased unpleasantness is out of sight, out of mind if we don't just cover it, if we just cover it all up? Is it that kind of mentality, or is that too simplistic?
No, I think he's a complicated man. Mitchell said to me one day, nah, he's not real complicated. My grandson's more complicated. Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Mitchell. I think he was somewhat more complicated than your grandson. He didn't like people. The currency of the day was Haldeman and Ehrlichman are keeping everybody from the president. The truth was the president was telling Haldeman and Ehrlichman, don't bring them in. In fact, Haldeman would tell, and does tell me on the tapes, about how he tried to get people in to see the president. He loved bill signings. Those were good. You could do bill signings, and then they'd be gone. He didn't like confrontation. He couldn't fire anybody. I mean, he literally, when he fired Haldeman and Ehrlichman, was in tears.
Well, the people you interviewed about Richard Nixon and his personality, because I presume some of that kinds of discussions had to come up in interviews that we got, right? This is a man, if he's that private, that secretive, that paranoid, that conspiratorial, that shy, maybe, that non-desirous of confrontation in a public unpleasantness sense, this is a guy who had been running for political office practically his entire adult life, if not, in fact, all of it. That is, I think, typically of politicians as being gregarious, outgoing, liking crowds.
They all told me no. They all told me he belonged to when he was in Congress, the Chowder and Marching Society, or whatever they called it. They'd have, social events, and Nixon might show up, but he was always uncomfortable. He was much more comfortable down here in Florida with Bebe Rebozo floating around, and
probably one of the more interesting things historians will have to deal with is that all the characteristics that we would normally assign to a successful politician were absent in the case of Richard Nixon, but he is clearly one of the most successful politicians of the 20th century.
He is he along with Roosevelt, Nixon. People don't realize it. It struck home this weekend. We're watching the women's soccer team in the World Cup, and they start talking about Title IX. Well, Title IX is Richard Nixon.
Right.
The EPA is Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, both the scandalous Richard Nixon and the legacy of Richard Nixon, is rich. I mean, his domestic policy, I call him a New Deal Republican. Remember, he wasn't running as Reagan did, a conservative. He was running against the Roosevelt-Truman wing of the Democrat Party. And so on domestic issues, while he was a strong anti-communist, he passed some of the affirmative action, the Philadelphia Plan. I go down the list. I mean, he didn't even know what Ehrlichman was doing. I remember at one point, his contributors said, what in the heck are you doing with this EPA thing?
You bring up an interesting point, because I suspect that you're right in your judgment as you said it of yourself. I grew up in the avowedly anti-Nixon household. That there are, to this day, at least for now, there remain a great number of historians who will fall on the side that Mr. Nixon is not neutral, and we either very much approve or very much disapprove, because that's what people do. And yet what you're describing is sort of and sort of allude to in the book is a portrait of a man who has a much different cast than the public perception of him. That his sense of domestic, you call him a New Deal Republican, that's probably a good description of the anomaly that I'm talking about. Take that into Watergate and into the collection. That portrait of Richard Nixon that would perhaps say Richard Nixon not only didn't mastermind Watergate, he probably knew less about it than anybody else.
Richard Nixon, if you believe the accepted version, Richard Nixon wanted to get the goods on Larry O'Brien's relationship with Howard Hughes.
Right, that's the supposed reason.
That's the supposed reason. In Silent Coup, we document that he got that information in February of 1972 when John Ehrlichman had Roger Barth get the tax return of one Larry O'Brien.
And let's be clear for our viewers who are not up to speed. The break-in occurs in June. So
this
what
is
you're
February.
saying is that 3 months or so before the break-in, the supposed reason for the break-in had already been reached.
And as early as 1971, early 71, John Dean was assigned to get the goods on Howard Hughes and the Hughes connection. And he actually contacted Bob Bennett, who was with the Mullen and Company and the CIA and all of that. So Dean had a motive also. He was on the same thing, but Ehrlichman actually produced the tax return, which showed $180,000 going from Hughes to O'Brien, and then O'Brien was splitting it with another individual who was a former Kennedy man. So he had the ammo. He didn't need to break into the Watergate for that.
Supposing I said to you, if I were wanting to get, quote-unquote, the goods, okay, on a particular situation, the one we're talking about, the Hughes connection to Larry O'Brien, and I had paper, but I also wanted or believed I needed to have oral confirmation, i.e. telephone wiretaps, what would be so wrong with that? Why couldn't it have been true, Len, that, and I am challenging, obviously, for the point, and then I want to come to the point of my question, why couldn't it have been possible for that break-in to have been over that reason? Now, I know what you believe the reason to be, and we can talk about that later, but my question is this. From an historian's point of view, the fact that this occurred here doesn't mean that it couldn't have occurred in June, just because you had this evidence in February. And does your collection or you address that?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. That's the problem with it. If you've got a tax return, and that's what you're going to leak, nothing's better than the tax return. That's signed under oath. You can't go leaking a tape of information you already have the hard evidence on. What was wrong, which was more wrong than the break-in, was getting the tax return in the first place. And Nixon would think of it this way. Kennedy got my tax returns, therefore I can get their tax returns. It's all fair game in those days. And so, and Dean was in charge of the enemies list, so he had a guy named Mike Acree who would just like every day get him tax returns on people that they considered to be their enemies. I mean, that mentality is tremendous. So when you look at this paranoid Richard Nixon, this guy who thinks everybody's out to get him, even in his own party, and when things happen, like the hiring of a G. Gordon Liddy, why would any administration hire G. Gordon Liddy?
One of my favorite questions.
But it all happens outside the sphere of the secret government. It goes on. But Nixon doesn't give a damn about that. He doesn't care He's got a political wing. What most people don't know is in 1970, something just like Gemstone actually happened. It was called Operation Townhouse. It was run by Murray Chotiner with a lot of illegal funds dumped in, a lot of mob money, and the object was to take control of the United States Senate. George Bush was a part of that deal. Lowell Weicker was a part of that deal. They had targeted certain states. They had yachts. They had prostitutes. They had the whole ball of wax all run out of a Georgetown townhouse.
By Murray Chotiner.
By Murray Chotiner, Nixon's original dirty tricks man, from all the way back in California till, as I told you, he visited Florida and did his thing with George Smathers. Nixon always had that component. That doesn't mean he knew everything Chotiner did. So when Watergate happened, and he began to think it was Mitchell right away, that's what entered his mind. That's what he thought he was covering up. He didn't know what the break-in was about. He just knew that it must be Mitchell, and Mitchell would never admit to it. He even, he says that on the tapes.
One of the things that we probably should clarify real quickly, because it leads to the question I want to ask you, is that we have, in the process of the relationship between you and the university and the collection and all the things we're going to do to put it out in the electronic format, a piece of that is an advisory committee that you have helped or have guided and assembled to help you understand what's the best way to do all of this and promote the collection and educate the public. One of those individuals is a young lady by the name of Monica Crawley, and who served in the latter years of Mr. Nixon's life as his secretary, if I understand it correctly.
She was his
personal assistant.
She became sort of an advisor.
She would be the person who would know whatever alteration, if anybody was going to know, other than personal family, I suspect. She would be the person who would know, would she not, if he ever altered or changed his own perceptions or beliefs of Watergate?
Well, it's in Nixon and Winter. She reports on the conversation she had, how he asked her to read Silent Coup, and
well, in our collection that we're getting, is there going to be a way for a researcher to look at Nixon in your period?
Let me correct something you just said, because okay. In thinking it through, Richard Nixon, this is a young lady from Colgate who writes him, and she's very articulate and obviously a very bright young lady. And Nixon remembering the Johnson-Doris Kearns relationship, I think that's what he was doing. He brought her in to write those two books because he wanted to tell his story through her, and then she would live on to be the Doris Kearns of the Nixon years.
Interesting.
And I think that's what Monica's all about. Monica and I have become friendly. Monica's on the advisory committee for a very good reason. She's young. She has a detailed knowledge of Richard Nixon. She will be accepted by her generation and what she has to say about Richard Nixon, just as Doris Kearns Goodwin is today. And I think he made a very shrewd move. Well, I decided to make the same shrewd move. The same with James Rosen, who's with Fox News now, who's writing a biography of John Mitchell.
And we'll talk about the advisory committee in a minute. I just wanted to focus on this question of, as we look at the collection, are we looking at the possibility through Monica Crawley of time changing Richard Nixon and having access to that?
Yes. And the thing I like about Monica is she's open to new thought. When I start telling her some of the evil side of Richard Nixon that I found, I'll be very blunt. I came out of this disliking him more than when I went into it. And even his most ardent supporters read Silent Coup and will say to me, Len, you haven't cleared them. You've mitigated a piece of him. Newest tapes indicate much deeper involvement in the cover-up, particularly from 73 on. Nixon was actually plotting and working in tandem as opposed to the so-called smoking gun tape, where he just sort of use the CIA to block the FBI. Dean suggests it. Haldeman says it. He thinks it's Mitchell. Everybody in the White House thinks that Dean is Mitchell's guy. So you have, because he came from Justice. I mean, that's the paranoia. You're a Haldeman guy. You're an Ehrlichman guy. You're a guy who knows whose guy.
Len, while we're talking about Monica Crawley and this idea that the collection may have a time perspective that grows beyond it, and that's a part of the reason for this advisory committee that we're talking about. For our viewers, let's talk a bit about the importance of that from your perspective and who the people are, and you mentioned James Rosen, but we need to be, and Benton Becker, but we need to identify these folks, because I think that is at least going to be a significant value to what we're trying to do here.
I think we all know that this has a national aspect to it, beyond Tampa, Florida, although I think it's important that it's here. And by bringing this advisory committee together, they are a resource. They're a resource to me, a resource to the university, but they're balanced out. You've got James Rosen, who's an anchor at not an anchor, but he's a reporter at Fox News, but he's been working for 7 years on a Mitchell biography. He's 30 years old, 31 years old. Monica Crowley is 30, 31 years old. We tried to balance it out. So we had Monica Crowley, and then we have Benton Becker, who's my age. We're the same age, 61 years old. So we get that perspective from the advisory committee. Obviously, the younger people will come forth and be there long after I'm there, and will carry on the collection and the promotion and so on. But W. Donald Stewart, who isn't involved in Watergate per se, but he has an overall view of how that secret government worked. He's on the advisory committee. He's in his 70s. Mark Barnett, whose father and he owned 5 private colleges and American International Television and did the Ehrlichman documentary, are big Republican fundraisers and people who understand this subject. And Mark's sort of in the middle of the 40-year-old group. And age does make a difference in trying to balance this out. Joan Hoff is in my age group again, with all from Berkeley, California, the free speech movement and women's issues, and a Nixon biographer. She brings that dimension to it. Yesterday, we added one more member, Manny Lukoff, from the University of South Florida, who's going to be retiring at the end of next spring, who gives us the mass comm journalism component that we had with Ray Locker, who will probably rejoin us when he takes up residence somewhere else in the near future. So it's really balanced. We wanted to get a lot of input. I don't control it, don't want to control it, don't want to control anything. I want them to come here from time to time and speak. I want them to send us people to help us enhance the collection with more things and make it so that it's usable. That's really the key to this, so that when people come here, they won't be floundering through tapes trying to figure out, well, should I listen to this one first or listen to that one first or whatever. So there's a combination of things. And if I were USF, to see that kind of recognition by these national people, I think is a big, big deal, because these people don't give their names freely. They are very reluctant to put their name, but they believe this collection is so important. I know Joan believes that the fact that I'm willing to do it just astounds her. She knows of no other reporter or journalist or even biographer or scholar that would let you in to everything they did. So it's a committee, but it's more an attachment to the collection, and people that you can pick up the phone and say, Joan, Peter here, this is what we're doing, what do you think? You don't need to go through Len Colodny to get to them. To have Benton Becker come here and describe him sitting across from Richard Nixon in a bathrobe, talking about this pardon that they're going to negotiate, and Nixon's first question is, how are the Redskins doing? Can I give you a pair of presidential cufflinks, sitting in this makeshift Oval Office he had out in San Clemente? And Benton describing that story, or how he almost leaves. So to have him come here, and with the richness of the transition from the Nixon to the Ford years, and to be able to talk here on the 25th anniversary, to me, is a tremendous thing for the collection, but it's a big thing for the university, because now the university is, while it's a Tier 1 Florida university, we're looking at about getting into the tiers nationally, and where people will recognize that serious research is going on here on serious matters. And we're all paying for the Nixon legacy. We're paying for it in Watergate, through independent counsels. We have been through the mill in the last 25 years.
Sure have.
And we have seen a total diminution, I say, through the Clinton administration, of the presidency itself. It's going to have to be rebuilt over the coming years in order for people to take it seriously. I think people take Bill Gates much more seriously than they take Bill Clinton. And I think that's really where we are today, which is, by the way, a tribute to the American people. The economy's going great, the country's doing well, but it's without the kind of leadership, that passion, that vision of where we want to go. Today, politicians are sort of bland. The Congress is, putting the Ten Commandments up. This is their idea of solving a problem. Howard Baker had it right. They should go home for 6 months of the year and do another job and then come for 6 months and leave, and term limits and all that. So we've suffered. Watergate, the Nixon resignation, he never should have resigned. He should have been impeached, tried, and found guilty. Now we believe we can drive presidents from office. Clinton, last January '98, Sam Donaldson gets up after the Lewinsky thing and says, in 7 days he'll resign. Well, he didn't resign. And we found out what an impeachment might be like. But what it did to the presidency, what Nixon did, that bad legacy is following us just like his good legacy. So there's the good Nixon, the bad Nixon, but he's been more powerful influence on young people's lives than they'll ever know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think
because all they hear is Nixon Watergate. And I've said to the folks at the Nixon Library, you people ought to deal with Watergate. You ought to deal with it straight on and stop trying to be the keeper of the flame. Their idea of a big event is to take checkers and rebury him out at the library. That isn't where it's at. This is where it's at. USF is where it's at, not at the Nixon Library.
That's an interesting point. What does the collection hold that the Nixon Library does not?
Nixon Library only has papers up to his vice presidency. Everything else is in the National Archives. That was part of the deal Becker made in return for the pardon, and in return for getting some contrition from Richard Nixon. But Bob Woodward has revealed in his interview with Becker and Ford in his new book Shadow that there was actually a draft pardon presented to President Ford prior to his taking office. And then there's another intriguing thing. There's this rumor that President Ford actually took over the military prior to being sworn in by a day or two. So there's all these little intriguing things that are out there that haven't quite, that, by the way, is something that profound.
That's very profound.
Very profound. I have every reason to believe it's true, but it's something that you can't do what you do in Silent Coup and name your source and why you believe it's true and who did what to who to make it happen.
Okay, we won't talk about it. Let's go back to something real mundane for a minute.
I'd love it.
Tell me what you think as a professional journalist, because clearly you're that, and whatever else you may be in the minds of readers and viewers and whatever as an historian, or if they're convinced of the traditional interpretations, maybe the devil incarnate. But despite all of that, tell me as a professional journalist, what does the collection do for journalism students at USF, and we'll talk about electronics later, but what does it do for journalism students as opposed to history students?
I think this is a real important, just like Richard Nixon had a profound effect on us through these last 25 years, Bob Woodward and Bernstein had a tremendous effect on journalism. It totally turned journalism on its head. The myth became the reality. We actually have people out there digging and going into anything they can find in any piece of the press has become almost celebrity journalists. We got them being paid millions of dollars to be. Diane Sawyer is a good example. She worked in the press office for Richard Nixon. There's something very important that we need to learn. Journalism is becoming diminished by too much news, if that could be put that way. Quick to get it out, beat the other guy. Cable has changed everything. The internet has changed everything. The Woodward and Bernstein of the Clinton affair turns out to be Matt Drudge, an internet gossip something or other. When they couldn't get the story out one way, they got the story out the other way. The kind of journalism I like to do, the analytical stuff, take my time, keep going back till I feel comfortable with what I'm putting on down and I can live with it, that's not there. The problem with Woodward is Woodward has lied about who he is, and this collection deals with that straight on. There's no question in my mind that he has fabricated significant parts of his background. And that raises the question, if he'd lie about who he was, why should I believe what he writes?
Let's, for the purposes of this tape, clarify that issue, because it's certainly one of the more controversial factors. In your book, Silent Coup, if I remember correctly, you have claimed that, contrary to what Mr. Woodward and Al Haig have claimed, that they had no prior relationship with each other. And you believe you have documented that there was one. You want to describe that?
Yeah, this was sort of the part of the Hogan book where Hogan could only take it so far in Secret Agenda. He was able to get a few people who were who did this briefing job, this secret briefing job that Woodward did, to say that Woodward was one of theirs, even though Woodward had denied it. He called himself a communications duty officer. We went out and we started digging. We went to people at the NSC like Anthony Lake, who later became National Security Advisor. We went to Roger Morris. They all told us, yes, we saw Woodward come in here, and he was briefing Al Haig in 1970, late 1969. Well, if that's true, what's going on here? He says he didn't meet Al Haig till 1973. He said he hated the Navy. He portrays himself as a guy coming out of high school who's like a loner, who likes ham radios, yet he gets one of the most prestigious things you can get, an NROTC scholarship to Yale. I mean, that is big deal, and those of you who haven't been in the draft don't understand what that meant. I mean, this wasn't like he was picked out of a hat.
Right.
And he was fast-track Navy. The first ship he served on was the floating White House. This guy was on the very fastest track you could be on. Is it enough to have Roger Morris, and is it enough to have Anthony Lake? Maybe for Woodward it was, but it wasn't for me. I needed the man, his boss, who would say, I sent him. And Admiral Moore did just that. He did it once. That didn't satisfy me. I said to Bob, we've got to go back 2 years later. I said, I want to hear that story again. I want to know for sure that Admiral Moore is going to say that he sent Bob Woodward to brief Al Haig in the White House in 1970. And he did.
And in the collection, somewheres in the process, you have asked that question directly of Bob Woodward?
Yes, you will have one of the rarest interviews with Bob Woodward. It's an hour-and-a-half interview that takes place in his kitchen. We had dueling tape recorders going. He had his tape recorder, and he had a flunky holding his tape recorder. Bob and I had to do our own tape recording. And he said, I defy you to produce a single person that said I briefed anyone. And we did. We
and in the
5.
collection is the statement with Admiral Moore, also equally accessible, to be laid side by side.
Right. And, by the way, we didn't stop there. We went to Secretary of Defense Laird, who we thought was also a credible source. And he supported Admiral Moore. Yes, we knew Woodward was briefing Haig. So wait a minute. How come Haig doesn't tell Nixon? And Monica Crowley and I have had a very interesting conversation about when the president learned through Silent Coup of this relationship he knew nothing of. Why would Haig not tell him, hey, I know that guy, we can do something about him? You see, on the tapes, you hear Woodward say to his aide, Ron Ziegler, you tell Gergen, David Gergen, he knew Gergen knew Woodward, you tell Gergen to tell that SOB Woodward, blah, blah, blah. Well, why didn't he say Haig? Because Haig didn't tell him. I think 5 credible sources saying that this event happened and that Woodward did this is far better than a guy in a garage.
Let me ask you 2 questions as an offshoot of that. And the first deals with the concept of what I remember to be, which doesn't make it accurate, only what I remember, to be the journalistic standard behind the Watergate stories. The journalistic standard was for factual evidence before the Post was going to put a story out dealing with Watergate during the time it was happening. According to what I remember, they had to feel comfortable they had 2 credible sources other than Deep Throat before they would publish anything. Assuming that's true, you, on the other hand, are claiming that this person, Bob Woodward, I don't think I'm being too blunt, was a liar.
He's a liar.
How do you match those 2 ideas?
Because I don't know that that's true. I'm fortunate, as we sit here today, to be co-authoring my next book with Maxine Cheshire, who spent 25 years at the Post, was there when all this happened. And the whole Deep Throat thing is a fiction. They knew, they had to know who Woodward's source is. You don't print this kind of stuff unless you, from a 9-month guy who's a city reporter, that doesn't make any sense. In fact, the first Deep Throat conversations with Woodward were over the Wallace shooting, not over Watergate, which was in May. So, again, Haig had that information. We're able to show who had the information that Woodward was getting to what Woodward got. So if Haig didn't have that information, the tape gap being the most obvious one, the fact that Woodward knew 10 days before the so-called 18.5-minute gap was found on the tape, he knew that, quote, he writes, deliberate, and this is all on the interview tape with Woodward, so you're going to hear how he bobs and weaves around it. But the bottom line is, at one point when we told him we had a source on him, he said, well, name your source. And I said, you tell me who Deep Throat is, and I'll tell you my source. I wasn't going to give up Admiral Moore at that point. But the fact of the matter is, we did better than the Post. We went 5. I don't believe that 2 people knew about a tape gap that wasn't going to be discovered. I just don't buy it. The other thing that's really troubling is a chapter we call 5 Days in July. And it's Alex Butterfield's revelation of the tape. Woodward goes to the Watergate Committee. His friend Scott Armstrong is working for the Democrats as an investigator and says, call this guy Butterfield. He's got some, he doesn't do it once, he does it twice. Damn it, if I'm a reporter, I want that story. I'm going to send him up to the Hill. There's something wrong. And then Woodward learns the Saturday after the Friday in secret that this tape recording system exists. He learns it on Saturday morning. He and Bernstein must have at least called Haig at the White House, because the president was sick in the hospital with pneumonia, and must have at least said to him, is this true? Do you have a taping system? And they claim that, having confirmed that this is what was going to happen on Monday, they went to Ben Bradley, and Bradley said, that's a grade B story. We're not going to run it. They didn't run that story because they didn't want to tip Nixon off, so he burned the goddamn tapes. That's why that story didn't get in the Saturday paper or the Sunday paper. What kind of grade B story is there's a tape recording that'll back up John Dean? And now, I want everybody to understand, I'm quoting all the president's men. I'm not quoting Silent Coup now. When that story is in, and I just read it and my eyes glazed over. So, the whole Woodward School of Journalism, and by the way, plenty of journalists have come to me and told me we're dead right. They're very suspicious of Woodward today, and this business of source. In the final days where Al Haig has to be his source. I mean, there's no one else that could have said the things except Kissinger or Haig that are in final days. In his latest book, Shadow, Haig is portrayed as this great hero, as he was in Final Days. There he was just a hero of the country. Now he's the hero of the universe. But the bottom line is that this is a sensitive thing. If he's a role model for journalists, we got a problem. He does all these source stories and won't tell you who it is. He was asked the other day, well, now, who told you that? Well, I talked to a lot of people. Well, who the heck are a lot of people? Bob Bennett denies talking to him about Clinton, me breaking attorney-client privilege. I mean, Woodward manages to get interviews that nobody ever gets. So, and he is a standard by which modern American journalism is defined now.
Is Al Haig parsing words when he claims he is not Deep Throat, or is in fact your point that he's a liar because he is Deep Throat? Which is it? Deep Throat never existed. Deep
Throat doesn't exist. Deep Throat was Cy Hirsch, who got a copy of the first draft of All the President's Men. There is no Deep Throat. It was made up by Alice Mayhew and by a couple of other individuals. I think Nora Ephron was in on it. She was Bernstein's wife at the time. The book wasn't selling. And this isn't news. David Opes came out with this. It's on my website in a recent book. He's their book agent. He says he doesn't exist and didn't exist and it was made up. It was made up to sell the book. They didn't, the movie. It was all a fiction. Haig was a primary source, but there were other sources. And we asked Woodward in our interview, how about the payoff money? How come he didn't know about the payoff money? Boy, if you had a payoff money in the summer of 72, you'd own Nixon. It would be over. He didn't have that story. John Dean had that story. So they don't know the Dean side. And so they've got all these people chasing their tails. Who's Deep Throat? Who's Deep Throat? And then they've come up with the cleverest idea of all. We'll tell you when he dies.
Right.
That has got to be one of the great literary devices of all time. If Colodny's controversial, what in the heck is that? We'll tell you when he dies. It's 25 years and somebody dies one day. So it's him. Well, how do we confirm that with him, Mr. Woodward? Well, take my word. The same Woodward who lied about his secret military relationship and how he was able to resign a commission in the middle of the Vietnam War. I mean, there's just a lot about Bob Woodward in this collection. And his father, I mean, he swore he didn't work at the White House. His father said, oh, he stayed that extra year to work at the White House. That's in the collection. So you get the wives back it up. They back up the Hague relationship. So there's a whole lot of things that journalists should be looking at in this. They ought to be critical of Len Colodny. Did he really have the source? Did he really have the evidence? Did he have the goods for what he says? Whether you agree or disagree with his conclusion. Maybe if you look at the evidence, folks, you'll agree that Colodny was right. Maybe you won't.
Len, let's change subjects because we don't have a lot of time left. We're coming to the end of this. We talked about the research in the collection and how to orient a researcher to it, and we're just trying to, it's too big, it's too huge a subject to get into great detail, but you know and I know, and we're informing our viewers now, that we plan on taking this collection to as public as it can be, which means putting it out on the web. What does that do for the point of organization or research methodology from your perspective?
Well, without the technical knowledge, what I envision in my brain is that let's assume we're talking about, forgetting the Dean section of the book and how that's organized in the form of the legal material. But as you would go through a chapter in the book, if we can do it, when you hit on a specific fact or you read a specific fact, that will be highlighted and you can click on it and you'll see the evidence that supports. Did Moore really say that? And what context did he say it in? Colodny is just quoting one thing. So I envision a book one day where people will be reading Silent Coup books 1 and 3 and be able to immediately go to the evidentiary material because it'll be linked. Now, how we do that and how technically, I know it can be done, but it's a major project. And we would do the same thing with the legal stuff. When you got to my declaration and I said, exhibit such and such, you'd click on the exhibit number and up would come the evidentiary material. That's the kind of book it is, but we couldn't do that when I wrote Silent Coup. There was no internet. USF offers the world this expanded Silent Coup. But more important than Silent Coup, which is just one chapter, is going to be what follows it, and taking those strings of evidence and looking at it differently than Len Colodny looked at it. All of that, and with new information, I think that's going to make a big difference. I really do. And that's what was so intriguing. When Sam Fustikian sort of put this in my head, he said, Len, you don't have to go to these other schools. We can do it. We have the technological ability to do it. It's your hometown. This is where you live. This is where your family is connected to the school. He gave me a wonderful sales pitch. But the real pitch was the technology. And that's what I began to envision. I could read Silent Coup and see the evidence to support it, which I could never do when I wrote the book. I could footnote it, but what a footnote this will be, or an endnote. You can go and see the actual document or read the transcript of the tape where so-and-so said such and such a thing. Or, if you're here, you can go to the full transcript and you can get the tape or listen to the tape. We may even be able to do audio there's just so much that we can do. To hear the voice of John Mitchell, to hear the voice of John Ehrlichman or Bob Haldeman, you'll have the Ehrlichman documentary here, which has some marvelous new stuff in it that I was the consultant on with Tom Clancy and so on. So that material will be here. But I just envision that researcher out there saying, oh, come on, Colodny, what do you got? Come on. Yeah, really, Woodward's a liar. Come on. Click. There's Admiral Moore. Click. There's Mel Laird. These guys all making it up, got nothing better to do. But that's the book. The book now becomes the universe of research material. That's how I see it. Now, I don't know if it can be done technologically, and I hope I live to see it. But I believe USF will be pioneering a whole new form of history research by doing this. And sort of Silent Coup is the test baby to see if it can be done. I don't think anyone will argue that it's one of the best documented books. Fred Grabowski, the archivist that handled the whole Nixon project at the archives, calls it the most important book since Nixon's resignation. Doesn't agree with all the conclusions, but there's no question about our fact-finding. There's no question about when we say we have it, we have it. And I think that's really the key to this. So it makes it a wonderful test tube for historians. We take this book, which is controversial, we take the author who's controversial, and we see what happens. My fear is one day I won't be controversial, I'll be accepted, and then they'll be looking for skeletons in my closet. So we'll just have to see how this works out.
That is probably a very appropriate place to end the interview rather than get into a lengthy discussion about your potential skeletons in the closet. Len, how can I thank you on behalf of the university for the donation? And I don't think there are words that can be used to describe what I believe, what you believe, and I think what hopefully our viewers after this interview will understand is the significance of this collection and what it can do for an understanding of one of the most significant periods in American history, and certainly in the 20th century of that. And I thank you for the interview. I thank you for the opportunity to do this tape.
Well, I enjoyed being here. I look forward to a rich relationship. We may not always have the same agenda, but we will certainly be looking at it and butting heads from time to time and working together as I know we're going to work together. I certainly have a game plan for Silent Coup, and I have a game plan that includes making this university a place where people will come, and when the word Nixon is mentioned, this is a place you're going to have to stop, whether you do it through the internet or whether you physically come here. And I want the university to be proud of it. This is something that Tampa can, as a city, can be proud of, and as a university, we start moving to that next tier up there in the other 49 states. So at least on this subject, I think we have a real chance to do it. And I am hopeful that this will be a lasting and wonderful marriage. And I go into it with the full bloom of a honeymoon.
Well, thanks, Len.
Thank you.